You are watching a video from the Hegel channel, and my name is Robert Veen.
Go. Well, paragraph 7, we have the positive, or do we call that the negative? We have the positive in paragraph 5, we have the negative in paragraph 6, or the other way around, doesn't matter. And we have the unity of both in paragraph 7. So that's how it begins. The will now turns out to be, is demonstrated to be necessary, the unity of both these moments. That is what he means to say. He's following here a logic that he develops elsewhere. I mean, the position, the negation, and then the synthesis, right? Well, we won't go into that. I mean, that's a very, very, very simple rendition of Hegel's method, but okay, it works up to a point. And certainly here in the introduction, where the development is more or less superficial, it works really fine. It's gamma, it's the synthesis element of the dialectical movement. So we have the reflection into itself out of the sphere of the object. We have the transition toward the object. Both are necessary, because there would be no ego that reflects on itself when there is no ego that is focusing on objects, and there would be no ego to focus on an object when there is no ego that can withdraw into itself. I mean, you can find all sorts of ways to express that, but paragraph 5 and 6 are obviously two sides of the same coin. Here he explains that a little bit further. It's particularity reflected into itself. Particularity expresses the German word Besonderheit. So we have Allgemeinheit, universality, Besonderheit, particularity, and Einzelheit, that's individuality. Now, individuality, Einzelheit, in Hegel does not mean to be an individual. It refers to the third moment of any logical development of a concept, which is the synthesis of the particular and the universal, which doesn't explain much, but that is what it is. So we have always Allgemeinheit, universality, which we found here in the will being able to abstract from anything. That is the universal element of it. Then we have the will, who is always particularized, because it always has a particular object. You cannot will everything at the same time. So to will something must mean that the will is particular. But ultimately, in individuality, in the ultimate Einzelheit, we have this one ego that is determined both by choosing objects that it wants and returning unto itself at the same time, separating itself from what it wants. So let's see how that works out. It is particularity reflected into itself. So it is this will that is determined by an object returning unto itself and becoming universal, and so brought back to universality, Hegel says, i.e., and this is coming from his logic, i.e., it's individuality. If there is a dialectic relationship between indeterminacy and determinacy, infinity and finitude, universal and particular, position and negation, then we have, it's a twofold movement, then we have Einzelheit, we have total self-determination. And that's what he's after. I mean, you might say that somebody who wants something is determined by that object. So it's It's not self-determination, it's being determined by something else. And you might say that self-determination is only possible in this negative way, by withdrawing from the object. And then you have two separate ideas, two separate elements that will never come together.
How do they come together?
They come together if my being determined by the object that I want is at the same time my self-determination. So my self-determination is not only negative by abstracting from all objects, it's positive by allowing myself to be determined by the object that I want, and at the same time separating myself from it. Is this at the same time that makes it possible to speak about the self-determination of the ego? I find that the object that I want expresses my being. I want it because it is I that want it. I do not want it because it requires it of me. I want it because I am focused on it. I find it pleasing, desirable, nice, whatever. It's me that wants it. And it's not the thing that requires me to want it. So if I want an object, like I want a car, I can at the same time distance myself from that car. I do not become that car. I'm not becoming determined by that car. I mean, if you want to say that simply, you say, no, because you own it. You have put your will into the object without becoming the object, without being determined by the object, but also without withdrawing from the object and being simply an ego without any determination. So how can the ego that wants something be determined by its object without being identified by its object, without being determined by its object? How can I determine myself to have this special relationship to the things that I want, where the difference between myself and the thing is maintained, and at the same time this unique particular relationship between myself and the objects is established? I mean, that is the very precise dialectic that Hegel is proposing here. If you own something, you can talk about it in two ways. You can say it's the object of your desire. The object elicited your desire. It's so wonderful that it made you desire it. Then you're not self-determining. Or you can say that you have a desire to desire whatever comes into your mind, and that this object is totally unimportant. The important thing is that you desire something, whatever you desire. Then you have a pure self-determination, but without any object. How do these two come together? In Hegel's concept of freedom, this is essential. This at the same time. I'm totally expressed by the thing that I own, and yet as an owner I'm totally separate from what I own. This duality or this contradiction, that is the essence of that kind of relationship. It's a spiritual relationship in which I can experience myself as spirit, because I'm not simply a subject that has needs and desires. I have to eat something, I have to drink, I have to whatever, I have to move. There's no necessity in that sense, but also there is not a withdrawal from the world like in Stoicism, where the world is just a spectacle for my understanding, and whatever I am within myself. Well, I think that's the best I can do at this moment to make it clear.
This is good, but it takes it takes repeating, because it's I shouldn't say abstract because it means something different to Hegel obviously.
Yeah,
But it's high
sure.
level of abstraction, so it takes a while and it takes repeating
Hmm. Well,
to really.
let's try and repeat it in Hegel's words, because what I was doing is um, explaining something before the need for explanation had arisen, because the need for explanation comes from the text that we now have before us. It is the self-determination of the ego, which means that at one and the same time, the ego posits itself as its own negative. Now there's something to put your teeth on. The ego posits itself as its own negative. That means as restricted and determinate. So that's the moment of particularity, right? That I want something. What am I doing when I want something? Well, I posit myself as something other than myself. I posit myself as the object that I want. Well, I posit myself because I'm doing the wanting. Yet I'm positing myself as no longer universal, but as something determinate, because I want the coffee, I want this, I want that, and that is what determines my ego at that moment. So, in a sense, when I want something, I deny myself.
Why is it posit itself as its own negative? Is it negative as something other than ego?
Yes, yes, yes. Because it has a restriction and it has a determinacy.
Okay. Yes, I understand. Yes, because at the beginning the ego was universal and had, or the will was universal and had no
Yeah.
restrictions.
But here the important words are at one at the same time, what he says here.
One at the same time.
One at the same time, we have this movement that produces universality and this movement that produces particularity. So he's saying universality and particularity, paragraph 5, paragraph 6, are not simply static characteristics of the will. They are movements, and they occur at the same time, and they occur as movements of one and the same thing. It's a dual positing, a positing of itself as its object and a positing of its object as itself. It's at the same time putting itself into its object as the thing wanted by me and withdrawing from that as me wanting that thing. So if you have the sentence, I want a cup of coffee, it's a matter of emphasis. If you emphasize the I and leave out a cup of coffee, you get the universality of the will. I can will whatever I want to will. I mean, whatever is there, I can will. I can want. If you put the emphasis on the cup of coffee, obviously you are taking just an example of what you can will. It's just a particular thing. So the will that is engaged in that cup of coffee is, of course, a particular will. So the I that is doing this willing, this volition, is of course also a particular thing. But it's the same sentence. It's the same sentence. I want a cup of coffee. If the emphasis is on the I, it is a universal sentence. If the emphasis is on the cup of coffee, somehow it makes everything particular.
What is, I again forgot, what is the relation of the will and the ego?
The ego is the subject that exercises the will, that does the willing. So it's the I that, the ego that thinks and brings its thought into action. Because thought into action is the same as will.
Yes, we mentioned that, but it is good to repeat it.
Yep. So when he here says the ego posits itself, that's an act of the will. It's not the ego understands itself. No, it posits itself. It does something. It takes a position in the world. It prepares itself for action, or it acts in the world. But I mean, this way, I want a cup of coffee. If you emphasize the I, the cup of coffee becomes an example of an infinite number of possibilities. If you emphasize the cup of coffee, the I becomes something particular. Is this moment, this subject, is determined by that object, by that cup of coffee. And you have to read a sentence like that, I want a cup of coffee, hearing both emphases at the same time, which is peculiar, because the I in the sentence, I want a cup of coffee, with the emphasis on the I, is the universal I, that can want anything. And the I in the sentence, I want a cup of coffee, with the emphasis on the content, is a totally different I. It's a determinate I. It's this I that wants at this moment this particular object. But of course they are the same, they are identical. The I in the sentence, I want a cup of coffee, is the same.
Of explaining it,
Uh-huh.
I think you should write it down and post it, because this is extraordinary way of explaining it.
Well, I'm going to do so. I'm going to do so. And I'm going to publish with your, what's that in English? Approval, the video as well. So it's then present both ways.
It's a great way to explain it. The example is really fantastic, and it makes it very clear. It's because it's a difficult concept to understand.
I'm really happy about that. I'm really happy about that. Because I know that is difficult. It remains difficult. I mean, after you have explained what Hegel means by an example like this, you're still not there, because you then even have to make sure that you understand why it needs to be so. I mean, that's the demand that Hegel's philosophy puts on us. You can only say that you truly understand something if you understand that something in its necessity, that it should be understood like this, and that there is no other way of understanding it. I mean, it's nice to have this clarification of the text, but we still haven't done the real work, which has to be postponed till later, of figuring out why it has to be so.
Is the text is difficult, and the terminology is not static, like it always means the same thing, and it's really difficult to get into the text.
Yeah.
But everything is, as you say, necessary. Everything is in its place, and everything is in its essence when you have put enough effort into reading it.
Mm-hmm.
It is somehow simple, because he doesn't use too many different means to explain.
Okay. But still, look at the way he works here. How does this paragraph start? Not with arguments to reach a conclusion, but with a statement. He's just saying the will is the unity of both these moments. He's not going to give an argument. I mean, what I'm doing in explaining it is giving you an argument. And giving you an argument with the aid of an illustration or an example. But he's not doing that. He doesn't think he needs to do that. He's just saying, I mean, that's the speculative element of his method. You have this dialectic element of his method that is demonstrating that two sides of an opposition need each other. Two sides of an opposition need each other and are actually two sides of the same thing, the same idea. That is dialectical. But he is also speculative. That is to say that he simply formulates, expresses in language what you as a philosopher should be able to see, to intuit, to conceive, without giving you the whole of the arguments that you might need to explain that to yourself. I mean, that is The speculative element in Hegel is the difficult element. The dialectic is a fairly well understandable method. But because he identified reasoning with the aid of arguments with what he called finite understanding, or verstand, because he identified the two, he never gives you an argument. He wants to have this idea, the concept explains itself. What does that mean? That he doesn't have to give arguments. It means that he can just posit something, and if you are on his wavelength, you see the same. And that makes it sometimes infuriating to read Hegel, because you find out that you lack this speculative insight. I mean, there are arguments for this statement, the will is the unity of both these moments. Of course, there are arguments for that. But it's sometimes very, very confusing that Hegel doesn't give those arguments himself and leaves that to us, apparently. And what if we can't find them? I mean, there we are. We're really in a hell of a lot of problems. Okay. It is the self-determination of the ego which means that at one and the same time the ego posits itself as its own negative. I mean, I am what I'm not. That is what he's saying here. I am what I am not. I am the cup of coffee that I want that I am not. I can only want it because it's not me, but because I want it, it is me. At least as something that I desire and want. I mean, that is what he is saying here. I.e. as restricted and determinate, and yet remains by itself, i.e. in its self-identity and universality. So, despite paragraph 6, the particularity of the will, paragraph 5 remains true all the same. It's the universality of the will. It determines itself, and yet at the same time binds itself together with itself. So it loses its liberty by being determined, but at the same time, in that being determined, it understands that it binds itself, it determines itself. The cup of coffee doesn't force me to want it. And yet when I want it, I have determined my will to want it. So there's a kind of being determined by a cup of coffee, but it's not a cup of coffee that is doing that determining, I'm doing that myself. That is the whole idea. The ego determines itself insofar as it is the relating of negativity to itself. I am denying my pure universal freedom by wanting this particular thing. What is my will? The ability to will anything. But what is my will when I want something? Then my will is to will this particular thing. It's no longer the ability to want anything, because now I want something in particular. So the ego determines itself in having this object that I want, insofar as it is the relating of negativity, the relating of the negativity that brings me to the object as that other thing that I want, and it relates that negativity back to myself. So now it's no longer being determined, now it's determining itself. I have to open the door, just a moment, please. So he is saying the same thing that I have been saying, but he is saying it very, very succinctly, but you can see what he meant, right?
Yes. Yes, I was just looking at the notes that I made before for some questions, and you just answered those questions.
Okay.
That were unclear.
That's always good. But this is a very interesting sentence. If you understand this sentence, then it's also the summary of the whole. And that is nice.
Determines himself. Yes, you explained it by choosing an object, I'm negating the universal freedom.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So the particular.
I would never be able to understand it myself. I would never explain it that way. It would be a mystery because it's in the questions, that very sentence.
Okay. But you must understand there are levels of understanding Hegel. I mean, at one level, to get the point of a paragraph, to get to the essence of the matter, and to understand how these paragraphs are linked together, that's quite an achievement already. And the most difficult thing, that is to understand why Hegel chooses exactly this language at this moment to express himself, and why that is necessary. I mean, most of the time in the phenomenology, I'm quite happy to understand the focus of a paragraph and how you can summarize it and understand how it functions within the whole. And I have not a clue what he means by 3 or 4 or 5 sentences in that paragraph that seem to be totally superfluous. So Hegel can be infuriating, especially when you desire to understand each and every element of it. But sometimes that's not necessary. If you take here, for instance, the opening sentence, the will is the unity of both these moments, and you search at the end, what is the most evident sentence? I think this one. This is the freedom of the will. It constitutes the concept or substantiality of the will. So what he is saying here in the third line from the bottom is that this first line is what he is aiming for. This is what he wants. So in a sense, all of this you don't need to understand in order to understand how Hegel proceeds in his thought. And anything that you understand from this part of the whole is wonderful. But still you can make out what he is going after if you take the first and the last sentence. And in many paragraphs, this is exactly what you can do. Hegel has this wonderful method of putting the speculative sentence at the front. One sentence that says it all. And then he goes to explain that dialectically, and sometimes he gives an argument. Most of the time he doesn't, but he develops that idea, and then he comes with the conclusion of all of that, which is the part where he makes a transition to the next paragraph. So take the first and the last, understand that, and you're home free. And the rest is is important to understand more than just the flow of the argument, but to really understand the argument itself, and to find maybe the problem that is there. But this method of the first and the last sentence works most of the time in most of Hegel's works, with the exception of Philosophy of History, which is not written like that, but for the Encyclopedia, the Phenomenology, it works wonderfully. Okay?
That is very useful information for reading.
Try it. Try it with our next paragraph. Okay, but we'll stop here. At least the recording will stop here, and we'll next time we will continue with paragraph 8.